Okay, so hello everyone. Welcome to this morning's presentation on document accessibility basics for Global Accessibility Awareness Day. Global Accessibility Awareness Day, or GAAD, or as some screen readers read it, GAAD, which is always a little bit amusing when you're listening to it. So GAAD is all about taking some time and to think about and learn about and discuss accessibility. So that's what we're doing today. So get to the point where I can change slides. Excellent. So for those of you who haven't met me or don't know me yet, my name is Michael Hanscom. I'm Highline's Program Manager for Accessible Technology. And so I support faculty, staff, and students in making information accessible to people with disabilities. So this includes all the students that we work with. This includes staff and faculty here at Highline. And of course, this includes the public that we work with as well. We want to make sure that everybody has access to the materials we produce. And then just on a personal note, I'm a science fiction geek and a Star Trek fan. So those kind of things pop up in conversation fairly frequently. So the reason we do this is that not everybody who has a disability discloses. We have many disabled students and employees who have disabilities and don't talk about it for one reason or another, or they've disclosed to some people and not others. But there are a lot of people with disabilities that we simply don't know about. And so it's always a good idea to keep this in mind. People don't need to be disabled to benefit from keeping accessibility in mind. There are a lot of accessibility techniques that just make things more readable, more legible, and easier for everyone to access. Creating with accessibility in mind saves time when accommodations are needed. Since students can request accommodations at any point, it's entirely possible that a student may realize, partway through the quarter, or partway through the year, or just as situations change, that they need accessibilities that they haven't discussed or haven't realized before. And so if you've worked to create documents with accessibility in mind, it's a lot easier and saves a lot of time when someone says, hey, I have this accommodation that I need, and then you're ready to go, and you're not scrambling at that point to figure out how to put it all together. And it is, as a educational institution, it's a federal requirement. So legally, we have to keep this in mind as well. And then info on all of these is available from the State Board of Community and Technical Colleges. Now, at the end of this presentation, I'll have a link where you can download this presentation. So when you see links on the slides, I know they're not clickable now, but you'll be able to get the full presentation and then follow links to anything you need when this is all done. And then specifically for faculty here at Highline, in the recently updated faculty contract, we do have language about accessibility. Just saying that there are certain levels of accessibility we expect for classes. These are just excerpts, that's not the full language, but basically we just say syllabi must be accessible, and then any electronic content in the court must meet accessibility requirements by the third quarter they're used. That gives you a little time as you work on things to make sure they're accessible. So if you're working on older materials, you can bring them up to date. If you're working on new materials, you can make sure it's ready to go. The sooner the better, but we do give you a little bit of grace period. So that's just a brief overview of the new contract language. And along with that, for a while now, Highline has offered an inclusive syllabus template. Last fall, we updated it to be an accessible inclusive syllabus template. So if you as a faculty member are developing a new syllabus or revising an older syllabus, you can download this template, just copy and paste everything in, and then you've got a really good baseline of accessibility to start from. So now just starting to get into some of the basic ideas and the tips when you're creating documents. So this is for faculty, this is for staff. If you create documents that go out to the rest of the college, or if they're going out to the public, from here on out, we're going to start looking at some of the things to keep in mind as you're creating documents. One of the first things to keep in mind is to use styles to define headings. Now, what this means is that a lot of times when we're creating a document and we're setting up different sections, If there's a title line or a heading line, a lot of times we'll just select that, format it, we'll set it bold, 14 point, something to make it stand out, which works well for sighted users. However, if you're just formatting the text, it doesn't actually add any information to the document that people using accessibility resources such as screen readers can access. By using heading styles, the screenshot on this slide is from Microsoft Word. There's a styles option in the main toolbar. By using heading styles, it actually creates structure within the document, which may not be visible as you're just reading through it. But within the document, there's basically a little flag that says this line is a heading. That way, when someone is using a screen reader or other assistive technology, just as we as a sighted user might skim through a document and visually we can see here's one heading, here's another, and we can easily skip through a document to find those and find the specific information we need. People using assistive technology can then hit a key on their keyboard and gives them a list of these are all the headings in the document. They can then select the heading, jump to that portion of the document and access it that way. If we're just formatting text, we don't have those flags, they can't do that. So using styles is fairly easy. And then finding out whether you have styles, I'll show this in the next couple screenshots. You can display a document outline to see whether your document has that structure enabled or not, created or not. In Word, you go to the View menu, Show, and then there's a navigation pane checkbox. If you're using Google Docs, again, the View menu, there's an option to Show Outline. So I'll just show these really quickly. It's a little small, but again, if you download the full presentation, you'll be able to see a little bit better. But this is Word. There's the View menu at top. The navigation pane is here, and then it'll open up this sidebar. Now, in a document with no structure, you'll see there's no outline here. There's just a little bit of help text that says, hey, creating structure for your document is helpful. Where if you have a document that has defined the headers for the, it's always difficult doing this backwards, has defined the headers for the various pieces, you'll see the outline here in the box, and you can see the outline of the full document. And that way you know that you've created that structure. Someone using assistive technology will be able to move through the document very easily. And this is how that looks in Google Docs. Again, it's the View menu, Show Outline, and again, it's this left-hand pane that shows the outline of the document. Now, a lot of times when you're creating styles, Word and Google Docs, both by default, they have a number of styles already defined. There's one at the very top that says title. I really recommend just ignoring that. There are complicated technical reasons behind that. If you'd really like to know, I'm happy to expound on that. But it takes up time and it's fiddly little details. So get a hold of me at some point if you really want to know why this is. But I say just ignore the title style. Every document should have one, and we recommend only one, heading one style. Use that for the title of your document. And then throughout the rest of the document, just create it as an outline. Other heading levels maybe use multiple times. So you can have multiple heading 2s, heading 3s, heading 4s, just as in any outline. We just recommend that we ask that you don't skip levels. Like if you have a heading 2, make sure that your next level is a heading 3 and you're not skipping to heading level 4. And that's just for the simple reason of making sure it makes sense. If someone is working their way through a document and they jump directly from heading 2 to heading 4, it's on that point unclear to them, was this intentional? Is there a heading 3 that didn't get flagged correctly that they missed? Are they missing important information? So it just makes sense to make sure that as you're building that outline, as you're defining those headers, you create a consistent outline that doesn't skip levels. Oh, and I forgot to mention this earlier. If at any point during this presentation you do have questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. I'll be happy to answer them as we go along, or you can hold your questions till the end of the presentation. Either way works for me. Sorry, I forgot to say that earlier. So another thing I've heard about headings is a lot of times Word and Google Docs both come with just default heading styles. And maybe, they're not very interesting. You see them on documents all the time because they're the defaults. Just because we want you to use headings doesn't mean every document has to look exactly the same. If you don't like the heading styles that Word has defined, or if you want your document to look different, more personalized, they're very easy to change. All you have to do is when you have a heading line, make sure it's selected and set it to the heading level you want, heading 2, heading 3, whichever. Then go ahead and change the formatting until it's the way you like it. And then in the style pane, whether it's, and it's very similar in Word or Google Docs, you go to that heading in Word, you right click. In Google Docs, I believe it's another option when you get to that menu level. And then you can just select that heading and you say, update this heading to match what's currently selected. So it'll say, okay, you've formatted this heading this direction. It'll update that. And now that's how the heading will look the rest of the time you use it in your document. This also makes customizing your documents much easier in just the entire time you're using them. If you say you've had a document that you've been using a long time, you want to update it, you want to refresh it a little bit, make it look a little bit nicer. With a document that you've just formatted and not used headings, at that point you have to go through the entire document, select every line that you want to look different, and change the formatting line by line by line. Where instead, if you've used headings, you can just select one, change the formatting, tell Word or Google Docs to update the heading style, and then it'll automatically cascade that change throughout your entire document, and you've now changed every heading in your document instantly to look the way you look, to look the way you'd like it to look. So it's a really convenient way, but it's good for accessibility. And it's great for design. It knows, at that point, it's much easier to update a document and make it look the way you want it to look at any point. So moving on from headings, lists. You want to make sure lists are defined using one of the list options. Now, both Word and Google Docs these days are pretty good. If you start making a list with either dashes or asterisks, they'll usually see that and automatically create a list for you, but they might miss it sometimes, or you might be moving things around in a document and that list and the automatic function may get broken. So we just recommend using the little toggles that are here to make sure it's actually defined as a list. And again, going back to someone who might be using a screen reader, this allows them, as they're going through, the screen reader will announce, this is a list. This list has 17 items. You're on item 1, and then it'll read the item 2. It'll read that out. And it lets them know where they are in the list when they're moving into and out of the list. And again, it just makes it much easier for them to comprehend the document and the way it's set up. Tables. A lot of times when people are creating fancier structure for their documents, it's tempting to use tables for layout. You can use a table with a centered cell if you want a banner image at the top. You can create columns that way, and there's text on one side and text in the other with different cells. And there are a number of ways that this actually causes problems with accessibility. One of the main ones is that in order to help people navigate tables when they're used the way they're supposed to be used, screen readers will announce you're now in a table. You're in row 1, cell 1. You're in row 2, cell 1 or cell 2 or cell 3, and then they'll read the information. Now, this makes sense if you're navigating a data table with information in it that is presented as a table. But if a table's been used for layout, then all of a sudden in the middle of, surrounding all of the actual content of the document, they're getting all this extra extraneous information. You're in a table, you're in this cell, you're in that cell. And it makes navigation more difficult. And there's just a lot of extra information that actually doesn't pertain to the actual content of the document. So we always recommend not using, there are other layout tools you can use that's a little bit more advanced than I'm going to get into in this presentation. But we recommend the tables should only be used for presenting tabular data, not for laying out your document. Also, when you're creating a table and putting data into it, you'll want to keep in mind that a screen reader will always read left to right, top to bottom. So you want to make sure the data makes sense when read in that order. One of the common areas I see this, and I actually just sent a video about this yesterday, you may have seen already, is in grading scales. where 90% to 80% is this grade, 80% to 70% is this grade, and so on. A lot of times we'll set that up in columns. So the first column is 90%, second column is 80%. But if you've done that with table cells for each of those, the table will read across left to right. So you might end up with someone reading 90%, 80%, 70%, 60%, then it'll jump back up to 89%, 79, 69. This is difficult for me to do off the top of my head, but it ends up reading those in a different order than we as a sighted user might see as we're looking at the columns. So make sure that when you're using tables for data, that the data makes sense when it's read left to right, top to bottom. You should also define a header row. Now this is just the top row of the table, and in Word, the screenshot there shows the table design tab, and there's a checkbox for the header row. And that just says that allows you to define the first row of the table as saying, this is what all the information within this row contains. And again, going back to someone with a screen reader, as they navigate through a table, if there's no header row, the table will just say, you're in this cell, this is what the information is. And so it might just say, cell 2, 90%. But if you've included a header row at the top that says something like A grades or humidity or whatever that column is, it will say cell 2, humidity 90%. Go down to the next row, row 3, humidity 74%. But that header information, using the header row and defining what each column is, allows the screen reader to say not just the value of the data, but what that value refers to. So header rows, very important. Moving on from tables, links. A lot of times, especially these days when everything's on the web and we're putting links into documents, we want to make sure that links make sense when they're read. So again, screen readers read everything out loud. So you want to make sure that links, URLs are descriptive and hyperlink text and not bare URLs. So I have a few examples here. In the first one, we're pointing someone to some technical guidelines. And we say, in the document, we might say, read the guidelines at, and then there's the URL. Well, if you try reading that out loud, you can see pretty quickly that it's long. There's a lot of different characters in there. It's not very useful for someone listening to it. In the second example, and in the first example, it's not linked. So there's no way for a user to click on that link and follow it to its destination. The second example is a little bit better because it's linked, but again, you have this long string of characters to read. Not a very pleasant experience for the user. The third example is definitely better. It says click here to read the guidelines. So you don't have a long URL. It's linked so someone can click. But one of the things, there are reasons that we don't recommend saying click here or using something like more info. And that's because someone using assistive technology like a screen reader, one of the things they can do to quickly navigate through a document is bring up a list of every link that is in a document so that they can quickly skim through the links, just as we would visually. That's a link, I can go to that. They can quickly skim through the links and decide, do I want to visit this link? Do I need to follow that? However, if every link in your document just says click here, that gives them no information about where they're going. They're just going to get a list that says link, click here, link, click here, link, click here. They have no idea what that means or where those links go. And so we get to our final example where what we're actually saying is read these technical guidelines, the WCAG 2.1 guidelines. At that point, there's no bare URL. It's linked so that it can be clicked on, and it actually tells them what is being linked to. So again, when they get that list, they'll say link WCAG 2.1 guidelines, and they, okay, I know where I'm going. Now, continuing on with links, of course, when we're designing documents, a lot of times we're designing them either for electronic or for print use. And if we're designing a document that's going to be printed and handed to someone, these have different considerations than electronic documents. And here we're using accessibility in kind of a broader term, because here we're not talking about technical accessibility like someone using a screen reader. Here we just want to make sure that everybody can easily access whatever the resource is you're pointing to. So you want to make sure if you're printing URLs or including URLs in a printed document, you want to make sure that they're short, readable, and easy to accurately type. Because at that point, if someone wants to follow it, they can't click on it, so they need to type it on their keyboard into their computer, or of course, these days on a phone, they're thumb typing it. Much easier to make mistakes that way. So the examples here, so the first one is for Highline's Access Services. It's fairly easy, access.highline.edu. Easy to spell, it's a short URL. That's not terribly difficult to type into a computer or a phone. The second example, it's the same one I used in the previous slide. That would be very difficult. As with the third example, we send a lot of Google Drive links out across campus or to share with people. They're Google Drive links. They might be Google surveys if you're using the Google Forms tool. And all of these just have these long strings of 20 to 30 characters. They're all case sensitive, so it makes a difference whether it's a capital A or a lowercase a. This is very difficult for someone to have to try and thumb type in and get it all accurate. So if you have something like that for a printed document, I recommend using a URL shortening tool like Bitly, which is available on the web at bitly.com when you're creating links, but it'll create a short link, which is just bit.ly/ and then it's usually, I think it's a 7-character link. Now, you do still have to type that in, get the capitals and lowercase right. So it's still a little difficult, but it's a lot easier than this 20 to 30 string with a lot of slashes and then special characters like in the Google Drive link. So these are just differences. And then it's just a decision on whether you are creating a document. Is it going to be electronic only? Is it going to be printed only? Is it both? If it's both, do you want to include a way? Sometimes you can have, yes, as as Melupe points out, you can customize the Bitly links to make them much easier to use. So yeah, absolutely. Yes, back and forth. I had to reconnect to where I was. It's just a decision of, is this document going to be electronic, print, both? If it's both, you may want to do, sometimes what I've seen people do is use footnotes. So a URL will be linked in the document, but then there will be a footnote that lists out the printed version, the printable version of it. There are various ways to do this, or even creating 2 different kinds of documents. A few different ways to handle that. It's just something to keep in mind how the document is going to be used. Moving on, alt text. Many of you have probably heard about this by now. This is important both for documents, and one area where I see this get overlooked a lot is in email. When we're sending messages out across campus in email that include images, if you're promoting an event on campus, you want to make sure that the image has alt text. And alt text is just an alternative, a text alternative. It's a description of the content of the image. And so when you're creating alt text, you want to think about what's most important about the image and why it's being included in the document. If an image is purely decorative, it's just there, like maybe there's a cute little curly cue to separate sections, or it's fall, so you've placed a few fall leaves in your syllabus. Purely decorative, you can mark that as decorative if you're in Word, Office, PowerPoint, any of those. There's a checkbox in the alt text pane to mark it as decorative. And that tells the screen reader just to ignore the document. If you're not using Word, if you're using a different application that doesn't have that box, at that point you can just leave the alt text blank. Just keep in mind that anytime you leave the alt text blank, the user will not get any information about that image. So if it's decorative, that's fine. But if there's if the image is actually conveying information you want them to have, you want to make sure the alt text is in there. So when you're thinking about it, you want to think about what's the most important information the image is conveying, and make sure that that's included. Important text in the image should be included in the alt text. So like sending emails, if there's promotional images, if there are dates, times, locations, if those aren't included in the alt text, low vision users may not, especially if this hasn't been included in the body of the text also. It's always good to do both. But if all you send out is an image and there's no alt text, then someone using a screen reader just basically gets a blank email. So you want to make sure the most important image is there. If there's complex information, like if you're an instructor who's creating a textbook, or if it's a annual report or something along those lines, there may be a graph or a chart. You don't necessarily have to, map out every point, every line in the chart. But saying something like in my example here, you might have alt text that says, this is a graph comparing seasonal temperatures for several cities. Every city shows a yearly increase in the average temperature. You don't have to list the exact temperatures. You don't have to list the exact cities, because those might not be the most important part. The most important part of this theoretical image is average temperatures are increasing. So there's just a few different ways to think about alt text and how and what actually needs to be included as you're writing it. And if you ever have situations where you're like, this is a complex image or a graph or something, I don't really know how best to describe this or to write the alt text, that's one of the areas that I'm happy to help in. Drop a line, drop an email, stop by my open Zoom hours that I have weekly. I'm happy to help out with this. White space. Oftentimes in creating documents, you might have a section that only has a few lines on one page. You want to run it down to another. Maybe you just want a little extra white space between paragraphs. What's easiest is just hitting the return key a few times. Unfortunately, that gets kind of obnoxious when it's being read, because a screen reader will just announce that this is a blank line. It'll say blank. If you've put 8 or 10 blank lines in there to shove something down onto the next page, then they have to sit and listen to the document read blank, 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 blank. I'm not going to do that too terribly long, because you can see how it gets pretty annoying pretty quickly. So all of the various word processors include various ways to increase the spacing. You can add page breaks to push something onto the next page. You can increase the line and paragraph spacing that way. Again, there are a lot of formatting options you can use to increase that spacing however you want it, without just popping a bunch of blank lines into your document. Contrast. This comes in handy for any users with low vision, or oftentimes people with color blindness. This is an area that gets overlooked a lot. People with color blindness, especially red, green, red, blue, don't see colors the way we do, or people with low vision, things may not be as clear as they are for sighted users. And so if there's something with low contrast, like gray text on a white background, that can be very difficult to see, especially as fonts get smaller, or if it's a font with very thin lines. And so you want to make sure there's enough contrast, that it's black on white, or a good dark blue, or a good dark green. One thing that amuses me with Highline's blue and green colors is that our dark blue is great when it's put against a white background. The bright green is great when it's put against our dark blue background. But that bright green against a white background is actually not very high contrast. It can be very difficult to read. It's not quite as bad as yellow on white, but still, it's a little difficult. And so what I've always ended up doing for these presentations is the green I use for all of these, I've tweaked that to be a slightly darker green, because it's easier to see that way. There's an online tool called the Web Aim Contrast Checker. This is a really easy way to check contrast ratios. It includes a little eyedropper tool where you can just go in, you pick the foreground color, you pick the background color, and then the tool will let you know, okay, this is good, or this is good at this size, but maybe larger sizes are easy to read. So lower contrast might work for a larger font size, but it doesn't work for a smaller font size. But it'll help you choose colors and find colors that make sure that they're not that they're not difficult to read. Now for checking accessibility. So those are some just the basic techniques to keep in mind as you're creating documents. Once you have a document ready, or just at points as you're working on a document, you want to occasionally check it to make sure that you're not running into accessibility errors. So both Word and, well, all of Office's applications, but both Word and Google Docs, if you're a Highline employee at least, which I believe everybody is here, offer accessibility checkers. Words is built into the application. If you go to the review toolbar, there's a check accessibility button that will then open up the accessibility checker. This is a pane on the right-hand side of the toolbar. After you click check accessibility, this will pop up. And in the example here, there's an image in the document that does not have alt text. And so Word's accessibility checker pops up a little message saying, this is missing alternative text. You click on that and it gives you a number of options where the first one is the recommended action is to add a description. Below that, it's a little obscured in the screenshot here, but below that word gives you an explanation of why this is an issue and why it should be corrected. So there's some help information in there, but it just lets you very quickly, oh, I missed something on that image. I'll add the description and then it's ready to go. And it'll walk you through any of the changes that it finds that it needs to make or that it recommends that you make. Google Docs works very similarly. Google Docs does not have an accessibility checker built into it natively. However, here at Highline, as long as you were on a Highline computer here on campus, you should have access to an extension called Grackle Docs. If you're using a personal computer, you actually can install Grackle Docs and log into it under your Highline account. And again, this is one of those things that I don't dive into in this presentation, but I'd be happy to help with if you'd like. So in Google Docs, you go to the extensions menu, you should see a Grackle Docs option and then a launch button. Once you launch that, again, a pane opens up on the right-hand side of the document and it works very similar to Words, where it'll just scan through the document. Once again, that same image with no alt text. It says, hey, you're missing alt text. Here's how to add the alt text to that image. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that Word's accessibility checker, Grackle Docs accessibility checker, and then later we'll take a quick look at Adobe Acrobat's accessibility checker. No two will catch exactly the same things. They all do a pretty good job. They're all going to catch the basics. But don't worry if, for instance, you create a document in Word, you later open it up in Google Docs, run the accessibility checker again, and you see some other stuff. That doesn't mean like the Word document is broken or you've done anything wrong. It just means different accessibility checkers, they all catch the basics, but then when they move beyond the basics, they might catch some slightly different things. And then you can look at those, see and make the corrections, maybe go back to the original document, make the corrections there just to make sure it's balanced. But just keep in mind, it's just how things work. Now, moving on to Adobe Acrobat. PDFs can get a little bit tweaky, but again, Adobe Acrobat does offer an accessibility checker. So if you've created, or if you have PDFs you use in class that you got from elsewhere, or if you've created PDFs, exported them from Word or from another program, you can run the accessibility checker here. There's sometimes the accessibility checker will be in Acrobat's right-hand tools menu. If you don't see it there, then at the top of the Acrobat menu, you'll see a tools tab. And if you scroll through that, you'll find the accessibility option in there, and you can actually add it to the right-hand pane at that point for easier access. But again, it works very much the same way. You run the accessibility checker and Acrobat presents a list of accessibility issues it finds. Some particular quirks of Acrobat's accessibility checker is that no document will pass completely when it's first checked. This is simply because there are certain checks of the that Adobe's accessibility checker runs that it cannot check automatically, programmatically. These have to be manually checked. And these are things like checking the contrast. Are you using the right kinds of colors? Does Acrobat read the document in the correct order? So again, these are a little more technical. I'm happy to help with them. But the main thing is when if you run an Acrobat accessibility check and it comes up as showing some errors, that's always going to happen. It's not something to panic about. Now, different errors are easier to fix than others. Some can be fixed within Adobe. Some you might need to go back to the original document to fix. Again, this starts to get more technical, and I'm happy to work with people one-on-one if you want to go into more details with that. But because PDFs can be a little odd with accessibility, One of the questions I ask is if you're using PDFs, whether you got them from somewhere else or if you're creating PDFs to distribute to other people. One of the things I'm starting to ask is, does it really have to be a PDF? This is because PDFs often do have accessibility issues. While it's entirely possible to create a PDF that is extremely accessible, it's difficult, and it takes a lot more work than it does with other document types. And even the most accessible PDF often runs into problems if the layout is completely locked down, as it often is with PDFs. If someone is trying to view a PDF on a phone screen, because phones are so small, with a Word document or a web page, the phones can automatically reflow that document so it can to a different size, so it can easily be read. With Acrobat, the page size is locked, and so at that point they have to pinch and zoom, scroll back and forth. Much harder to read a standard size PDF on a phone than it is on a computer. And of course, as we all know, many of our students, many people in the community are using phones on the go all the time. So something to keep in mind. So if you're used to creating documents and then converting them to PDF before distributing them, think about whether it's really necessary. Does it have to be a PDF, or is a Word document fine? Or some other type of document? PDFs work best for documents with complex formatting that must be presented as designed, something like an annual report or something along those lines. But for most documents, a Word or a Google Doc, a Canvas web page, or even EPUBs, which there are tools to very easily create EPUBs, are much easier to make accessible. If you didn't create the PDF, if you got it from another source, we ask, can you download the same content as another file type? Sometimes you have a choice. Do you want this as a PDF, as a Word doc, as something else? Think about the type of document you're choosing when you download something. If that's not an option, can you contact the creator or the publisher to request an accessible PDF or a different file type? Can we work with those accessibility issues? Can we correct those using Acrobat Pro? Something you can do, or I can assist with. And this is a process called document remediation. Can we do that in-house? Or can the document be replaced? Is there something else with similar but with equivalent content that would be more accessible in another format? So just PDFs, they have their uses. They're good for a lot of things, but there are also issues where they're more difficult to use than other document types. It's just something to keep in mind. Of course, if you are creating PDFs, if there's a need to, you want to make sure that you're creating, that you're doing what you can to create an accessible PDF. So you want to start with an accessible master document. You've created the document, you've used the accessibility checker, everything's passing, you're ready to go. Key thing to know if you're in Microsoft Office, Microsoft Word, do not use the print to PDF button. This is also true on the Mac. On Windows, you can use various print to PDF options. On Mac, you hit print and there's a little save as PDF button on the bottom. The problem with that is that at that point, what you're telling the computer is, I'm printing this, only I want you to save it as a PDF file. But because the computer is thinking about it as printing, it basically at that point ignores all of the accessibility options, and it's basically just sending a picture of the document and sending it as a PDF, and you lose all the accessibility information. It's doing the same thing it would do as if it were sending it to a printer. So instead, you want to make sure you use the Save as Adobe PDF option in Microsoft, in any of Microsoft Office's applications. At that point, you're instead of printing it, you're saving it, and then Word or any of the Office applications will retain all of that accessibility information. We have a lot of documents around campus in our lives that have been printed to PDF that are unfortunately inaccessible, even if it was from a very accessible document. So you always want to use Save as Adobe PDF. If you're using Google Docs, it's a little bit more difficult because unfortunately, if Google Docs does allow you to just go to File, Download PDF. Unfortunately, I'm not sure, but I think on the back end, it's basically doing the same thing as print to PDF because those do not come out accessible. Instead, we recommend downloading it as a Microsoft Word document running Word's accessibility checker to catch any errors that may have cropped up, and then using Word's file save as Adobe PDF. So it's a few more steps, and that's just because Google Docs simply doesn't create accessible PDFs natively. Now, for those of you who work in Canvas, and this isn't just faculty, but staff also often create, well, maybe not often, but they do sometimes create Canvas courses for training or other materials. So when you're creating a Canvas, when you're working in Canvas, underneath the document editing area or the page editing area, you can see, I can't point to it because I run out of frame, but there's the accessibility icon. The accessibility checker icon is always there as you're working. And if it notes any errors as you're working, you'll see that little, like this one has a little 1 popped up there. And it'll say, hey, there's something that could be improved. So if you click on that, it'll open a little help pane to say, this is what you can do to fix the accessibility error. So that's there just by default on Canvas. We at Highline have also installed an Ally accessibility checker that is as an add-on tool to Canvas. So Ally scores are visible when editing individual pages, also in other points within the Canvas interface. You may have seen these already. They look like little gas gauges. They start at red and then go up to green, and there's a little arrow pointer on them. These Ally scores are visible when you're editing individual pages, or for each course you have, you can look at an accessibility report for that course, and that'll identify common accessibility issues. So again, this is just showing the Ally accessibility meter. It's shown at the top of the Canvas editing area. And again, and you can click on that and it'll give you a list of ways you can improve the accessibility of the page that you're working on. As I mentioned a moment ago, there's also a course accessibility report, which will give you an overview of the entire course's accessibility. So that report goes through every page in your course. It'll look at any attached or linked documents and videos and look for common accessibility errors, like PDFs that aren't accessible, videos that don't have captions, and other similar images without alt text. And it'll find those for you. And it'll give you a list of the types of errors and then a count of how many instances need to be fixed and link you directly to them so you can work your way through the course to improve the accessibility. So this is a screenshot of an accessibility course for a test course that I have. In this particular test course, the accessibility report shows up on the in your course navigation. If you don't see that, you can go to your course navigation settings screen and make sure it's enabled. And then it just gives you an overall score. In this particular case, my course is showing up at 87% accessible on Ally's meter, which is pretty good, but there's some room for improvement. If you scroll further down on that page, that's where you get a list of, these are the errors that Ally is finding. If you were to click on any of these rows, it would say, give you a little bit more information, like the very first one says this image does not have a description, so I'm missing alt text. Click on that, it'll give you a list of the individual instances, and you're able to go through your course line by line and make sure that all the accessibility options are as good as possible. And that brings me to the end. At 10:46, that's pretty good. So at this point, as I said, you can download this presentation. If you're handy with your phone, you can just hit you can scan the QR code, you could type in that bit.ly link, or of course, I'll also be sending out a follow-up email later on with links to the presentations where they can be downloaded. Now I've kind of thrown a lot of information over the past 40 minutes or so, and are there any questions? Is there anything I went over too fast or you'd like a little more detail on? I would be happy to answer any questions you have. I see them all. Thumbs up. Thank you, Amal. Excellent. More info on translation. As far as translation between languages,
Yes.
Yes, okay. Translation is difficult. Oh, well, goodbye. Those of you who are leaving, feel free to drop off. Yes. That we might need a little bit more of a one-on-one conversation with, because the reality is, even with captioning services like Zoom's captions or other things like that, and Google Translate and things like that, the trick to that is translation is just, honestly, it's kind of difficult. Thanks, Matt. See you later. Just because word for word translation obviously is does not convey all of the context and the meaning of what the original speaker was saying. Services like Google Translate and the other translation services do a little bit better when they're fed a block of text. But still, it's one of those areas where there's a lot of research. Companies are working on it, but generally speaking, automated translation tools I would recommend as a good way to get a basic idea of something, but not necessarily something that actually works for this document was in this language, now this document is in this language and everything's fine. I definitely would not expect that to be the case. So I don't know if that actually answers your question. If you have more questions on that or just want to chat, I'd say drop a line, get a hold of me. I'm happy to get into more details about what exactly you're looking for and whether that's something we can help with or not.
Okay, thank you.
And okay, people continue to drop off. So unless there are any further questions, I'll give it a moment to see. Then I think that will wrap up this session for today. Thank you to all of you who joined and who are still here. I appreciate you tuning in. And with that, I will go ahead and stop the recording. Thanks, everybody.